And I'm gonna okay. So yeah, David, I thought I'll just we can just do this sort of podcast style and I'll ask you questions and then you can fill in whatever you feel like I missed, if that
Okay,
sounds good to you.
sounds good.
Okay, so what exactly is insulin sensitivity and why is it so important?
Has the shirt on.
Who?
David,
Just do it.
Dr. Guy.
Okay.
Um, so insulin sensitivity is essentially how much insulin that most people don't, and most, am I cutting out or do I need to
Yeah,
change
you're
spots?
cutting out for me.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just change spots real quick. This will probably help. Okay, so most doctors don't even really know how to track sensitivity because none of them are actually involved with physique athletes, sports athletes, things of that nature. That so they're not really into the nuances of what does it what are the signs of getting insulin resistance way before pre-diabetes, way before any clinical things will show up. So most doctors are only going to check glucose and A1C. By the time your A1C and your glucose are dysregulated, insulin resistance has been happening for 3, 4, 5 years, way before any of those signs will show up. So the key metric that just about every single doctor misses and doesn't test is insulin itself, right? And the only way you're going to be able to tell if you're at the starting stages of some level of insulin resistance is when you have all three of those markers, which is glucose, A1C, and insulin tested in a fasted state. Because what that tells you is in a fasted state, how much insulin is needed to keep your glucose at that low non-fed state. So I don't really worry about the glucose number, right? Some people, their fasted glucose will be, a 92 or a 95. Some people it'll be 76, 83. Those numbers are really more genetically individual for, your age, your gender, et cetera, all of those types of things. But what really matters is that number correlated with how much insulin. The ideal number for insulin would be anything under 5. So a fasted insulin number of 5 or less. And it's not an on and off switch. Most people think of it that way, where it's like, oh, if it's a 5 and above, that's bad. That means that I have insulin resistance. And really what it's telling you is you have insulin that is being used, or you're secreting a little bit more insulin than needed to control that blood glucose. And what that means is the following: your body uses insulin, not blood glucose, to control when does it need to release fatty acids into the bloodstream to be able to subsidize fuel that isn't glucose, because fatty acids can be turned into glucose and vice versa. Glucose molecules can be turned into fatty acids. So it's interchangeable. The switch is your body paying attention to insulin. When insulin is a 5 and above, you're going to release less body fat or less fatty acids into the bloodstream for glucose support. When your insulin is low, your body is way more easily able to release more fatty acids into the bloodstream. And think of it more of like a dimmer switch, right? As insulin goes higher and higher and higher, you're going to release less and less uh, fatty acids into the bloodstream. And you're basically going to always be in storing fatty acids. You're going to be storing fatty acids more easily. Now, this is a adaptation from mammals. All mammals do this. This is exactly what happens right now, which is why we're kind of having this call right now, is just about every single person is going to display some level of insulin resistance at this time of the year, in particular, because you're a mammal. And just like every single mammal, there's a circadian mechanism that turns on and off depending on whether daylight is getting shorter or longer and whether that's being coupled with temperature or not. And so most people are familiar with just about every single mammal that's not a human at this time of the year is going to be putting on body fat. If it's for hibernation, they're going to put on an enormous amount of body fat. But most mammals at this time of the year are putting on body fat. The way they're doing it is by inducing insulin resistance. Now, they themselves are not doing it. It's not like they're changing their lifestyle. It's not like they're raiding their pantries and eating junk food. That's not what they're doing. What they're doing is normal behavior, which is I continue to eat carbohydrates because they're still available, but daylight is shrinking. So the central climactic nucleus starts to turn on more insulin resistant factors. So phenotypically, all mammals at this time of the year, including humans, will display some level of insulin resistance. It's almost unavoidable until you start inducing cold exposure. Cold exposure undoes insulin resistance, and this happens with all mammals as well, particularly mammals that hibernate and mammals that, like squirrels, they don't hibernate, they just stockpile for the winter. When cold is introduced to the biological system, it undoes insulin resistance so that you can burn body fat through the winter. This is particularly important for any mammal that hibernates because they're not consuming any food. They are literally not eating food, and they rely on their fat stores to burn through the winter for fuel. If they had continual insulin resistance through the winter, they wouldn't be able to tap into those fat stores. Cold exposure is what lets them do that. So as a human, right, you have control of your environment, your temperature, how much sun you get, to some degree, you know, depending on what your job is and that sort of stuff. And so if you go into the winter or the autumn months, I should say, so August, September, October, and you continue to eat the same, and you continue to not be exposed to cold exposure, and your daylight hours, actual sunlight, diminishes, you're going to induce a higher level of insulin resistance than would otherwise happen if you were spending more time outside, for example, or getting acclimated to the cold exposure that you're naturally getting from just the temperature of the season changing. And because you're allowed to go to the grocery store and buy carbohydrates that are normally available year round, that are not going to normally be available, that induces a higher level of insulin resistance. Again, this doesn't matter if you're an athlete or not an athlete, it happens to everybody. But in athletes, you can pick it up very quickly and you can undo it very quickly because you have a high level of output, you have a high level of muscular tissue that's going to take care of that. But for normal average people that you know, let's talk females, for example, typically a female is going to have like maybe 105 to 110 pounds of lean body tissue. That's the average female. They're just not going to have enough muscle mass and enough activity output to be able to undo that without doing other things like changing the amount of carbohydrates they eat, changing the amount of cold exposure that they have, and that sort of stuff. The more muscle mass you have, you can kind of undo some of that just by energy expenditure. But that's not the normal. That's not actually normal for most people. Most people do not have the exaggerated lean muscle mass that an athlete would. But you can pick this up transiently in athletes.
So what would you say, like what dietary changes can help improve insulin beyond cold exposure? Well, I guess let's go back to that. Cold exposure, how, just kind of like in layman's terms, explain how that helps improve insulin sensitivity through winter. And then what's like a practical application for people to get that in the winter, depending on where they live?
So the way that it does it is fairly simple. When you are exposed to cold, your skin temperature will drop. When the skin temperature drops, the skin then tells the central climactic nucleus to upregulate temperature regulation. It'll upregulate thyroid, it'll upregulate other factors that have to do with controlling your core temperature. And in order to do that, it's going to use glucose as fuel because it's going to uncouple your mitochondria. Cold acts as a protein uncoupler. It tells the mitochondria to produce more uncoupling proteins. And when you produce more uncoupling proteins, you essentially waste fuel, mainly glucose. Glucose will be used for heat production when you induce skin temperatures of 55 degrees or less. So that's the mechanism. We know that very clearly from lots of studies on lots of different mammals and all of that type of stuff. It's the same in all mammals. The same temperature, 55 degrees or less, induces that the circadian switch at the central climactic nucleus that upregulates that system. And so basically the way to do that is you regularly experience cold, 55 degrees or less. It does not have to be water immersion. It can be. It's certainly the fastest and the easiest. But
Yeah.
I tend to just lean into, I just go outside underdressed for the weather, and as much skin gets exposed to 55 degrees or less. That may take literally 10 minutes of I just walk outside and drink my coffee while I'm outside in the morning. And that's really about as hard as it needs to be. You can get cold exposure. You can get like a cold plunge and kind of do this year round, but I don't typically do that. I just lean into as the weather gets colder, I experience that same temperature change at the skin level. I ensure that I do it daily. And as long as that's happening, uh and you will notice that after about a week, especially like, so for me, it happened maybe a month ago is when the temperature consistently was about 55 degrees or less every morning. And after about 2 weeks of that, you notice that thyroid production goes up. You start to wake up in, not necessarily in the middle of the night, but right before your wake up time, your normal wake up time, you start to notice that you're a little bit warm, you're a little bit warmer than normal, maybe a little bit sweaty, and that's thyroid system being upregulated. That's all the heat production or one of the heat production mechanisms that's going to be upregulated when you start to experience daily cold exposure.
Okay, so tell me if this is correct here. I'm just thinking it through, like everyone else maybe is. The question I would have is, how does our body know we're going into winter and to become more insulin resistant? And then I would answer that with probably if we've been outside in the summer and our body is getting the higher UV index, and then that goes away, which happens kind of like mid-September, that UV index for most of us, especially if we're living in higher altitudes or higher, yes, latitudes, thank you, is going to go down in September. So now it's really hard for me to get above a 5 UV index. So my body knows, because I've been outside, I'm outside every day, that we're moving into winter. However, if people are not outside ever and they're just in front of their computers, their body is less likely to be aware that the seasons are changing, right? Which means they're going to likely be more insulin resistant all year, because their body doesn't know seasonally what's happening. So with people becoming more insulin resistant right now with the change in seasons, that's only if you're living like optimally from a health standpoint and getting outside regularly. Otherwise, your body has a hard time knowing what time of year it is if you're just always in climate controlled environment and exposed to artificial blue light all day in front of screens, and you're not getting outside, or if you're getting outside and you have sunglasses on and a hat and you're covered up, then it is hard for your body to know what time of year it is. Is that correct?
Yes. And yeah, that's 100% correct. So what I just described is what happens to everybody just living, forget about living in the modern world. Just this would happen normally to every single person even if you were a farmer outside every day, right? You would have some level of insulin resistance that comes up naturally through the season, right? Now, just like you said, modern living projects this as something that's happening year round to most people.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why that's happening that you highlighted is the lack of infrared and UV light. That's the switch that starts to tell the central climastic nucleus something is changing. The sunlight is being diminished, but we aren't able to turn on the secondary mechanism because we're not experiencing cold, right? So it doesn't know what to do with that information. And so it just assumes that you're in perpetual fall, which is the weather's still good, right? In September, the weather's not cold. It's fairly mild.
But the UV index go down.
But the UV index has diminished significantly. It's been cut in half, or almost by 100% for most people. So that's essentially if you wanted to word it this way, most people are living in a paused fall time frame where they're going to continually put on body fat, because that's what the mammalian mechanism has been set up to do in that scenario. Very little UV, very little infrared, and lots of carbohydrates still available, and the temperature is still above 60 degrees. Those are pretty much what most people live in year round, and that's going to elicit a level of insulin resistance that gets accumulated over time. And so then you end up with just about every year you put on 5 to 6 to 7 pounds that never really goes away. The reason for that is because you're battling uphill against the natural mammalian switch of insulin resistance.
Yes. So to circumvent that, getting outside 10 minutes a day, like a little bit less clothing, or doing a 3 to 5 minute cold plunge or shower, getting in just daily cold exposure. And this is something where I think people can get a little bit freaked out by, like, oh my gosh, I missed a day. I missed a couple days. Just like in general, I think David mentioned to me one time, it's like if you're watering your plants, like they're going to be okay if you miss a couple of days. If it's a daily watering situation with
Yeah,
your
yeah,
plant.
exactly. That's actually the best way to think about it. And it's just like training, right? Just because you missed 2 days of training because you were sick or whatever, doesn't mean that you start over. It just means you just pick up right where you left off because the weekly or monthly push is always moving in that direction, right? So when I say daily cold exposure, for most people that's doable. For most people that's okay, I just walk outside, right? It's really not that simple. But every now and then I don't have that ability, right? I got to get up and do some things, or I got to go, jump in a car and I got to be early to an airport or whatever, right? That's not the end of the world, and that really doesn't undo any of the changes. But I do want to point out something. Um, Depending on the time of year where you're trying to undo insulin resistance will dictate kind of what I say. Like you can go all out, right, in the summer and get a cold exposure session if you have a cold tub and UV. That's going to be the fastest way to undo insulin resistance by far, because you're getting a 1 + 1 = 3 type of effect if you're doing it in the summertime. So there is some advantage to, hey, it's summertime and I have a cold plunge. You can undo. I've seen people essentially drop their insulin resistance score, if you want to call it that, in half in the matter of like 3 or 4 weeks, right? That their fasted insulin is a 9 or a 7, and then 3 or 4 weeks later in the middle of summer, it comes back at like a 4, which is ideal, right? But in the wintertime, it is harder to undo because not a lot of people are willing to get high
Yeah.
levels of cold exposure. That's a lot harder to convince somebody to do. But can it be done? Absolutely, it can. Now, there is something to say here when it comes to genetics, right? Because we're talking about the mammalian gene setup or genetic switching that happens from season to season. Some people, for example, if you're from African descent or Indian descent, like the continent of India, those people living in northern climates like Michigan, Idaho, whatever, any higher latitude, but they're coming from a lower latitude, those people will have an extremely hard time with insulin resistance in the winter because their genetic setup is for really high amounts of UV, and they're just not ever really going to get that. And so that's where things like the recent, GLP-1 drugs that are coming out and stuff like that, those are all very valuable in that context. Because when I look at insulin resistance, or when I see that there's some level of insulin resistance, it also tells me about leptin. Leptin is the controller of the insulin resistance switch, right? So leptin is not being released into the bloodstream or let into the hypothalamus, one of the two, which is what's going to lead to further and further degradation of insulin sensitivity over time, right? And that
What is
happens.
that for those that don't know?
So leptin is a hormone that's in your body fat. And that hormone, most people just think that that tells the body how much body fat you have on you. And that is one of the things that it does. And it does about 15 other things, because leptin also tells the thyroid system what to do. Leptin also tells the hunger system what to do. GLP-1, GLP, and glucagon are all downstream hormones that get controlled by leptin. Leptin also tells POMC, POMC, how much alpha MSH to make. Leptin also tells you how much cortisol to make, because it also regulates activity output. So leptin is a master controller to how you're going to feel every day, and how much energy you're going to have, and how much hunger you're going to have, and how your thyroid is working. That is really what's controlling all of biology. And leptin, because it's embedded in fat, is going to be released by UV light or by cold. Now, essentially, they're the same, and a lot of people don't really know this, but when you get cold exposure on you, you're going to upregulate heat production. Upregulated heat production is light, infrared light to be specific. So leptin also gets released by light internally when you experience cold, or externally when there isn't any cold and you're experiencing UV light. But it's located in fat cells. You don't have very much fat on your face, and you don't have very much fat on your arms. So if those are the only things that get exposed to infrared light and UV light, you're also not interacting with leptin very much. It's the places where most people don't expose themselves to sunlight that contain the most amount of leptin, the most amount of cholesterol, the most amount of your body fat. And that is a crucial thing. Now, a lot of people have kind of touched on this, but they never highlight it, that fat is not just fat. Fat is a organ, and it's a hormonal organ, meaning it has information inside of it. One of them is leptin, the other one is cholesterol. Those cholesterol turns into all your sex hormones and your cortisol, and it has leptin embedded to it, so that when it gets interacted with by light, it then tells the brain, hey, this is how much body fat this person has and how much light they're getting, whether that's through cold exposure or actual sunlight. And then that upregulates certain factors or downregulates certain factors the next day. That's how that system works.
Okay, so ways that leptin gets dysregulated would be lack of sunlight, lack of cold in the winter, and then also things like sleep, obviously, is going to be a big
It's one of the most important ones, right? This is why GLP-1 drugs are so successful across the board with just about anybody that takes them, because if because it's a two-step system. Leptin is a two-step system. There's the releasing into the bloodstream, and that happens with what you mentioned, cold exposure and light exposure. So that releases it into the bloodstream. At that point, it hasn't done anything yet. At that point, it's just floating around in the bloodstream. When you sleep, it at around midnight or so, it should be let into the hypothalamus. It should cross the blood-brain barrier. It will only do that if there's been proper melatonin release, then thyroid, T4 manufacturing, and then after thyroid comes growth hormone release. Growth hormone will never be released if insulin is high, right? So if you're eating large amounts of carbohydrates before bed, or you're spiking your insulin through blue light exposure at night, insulin being high automatically circumvents the growth hormone release. And if growth hormone never gets released, it doesn't let the brain become permeable to leptin coming into the hypothalamus. So most people mess up in one of those two steps. Either it's not being released into the bloodstream because they just don't spend any time outside, whether it's light or cold exposure, or they may do that, but they still end up getting subpar results because their sleep system is not appropriate, right? A lot of people literally say this, where it's all about sleep. It's all about how you sleep. It's if you're not getting good sleep, everything kind of goes to crap. But nobody really tells you how to improve your sleep, right?
Mhm.
Things that I rely on heavily is blue light at night needs to be the first thing that needs to be paid attention to, right? It doesn't mean don't use it. It just means the moment you're done with dinner and kind of doing things, you should immediately start changing the mood of the environment that you're in by reducing blue light exposure, increasing red light exposure, so that your melatonin gets secreted to the highest degree that your body can make. And then the degree that melatonin gets secreted will be how sleepy you get. And that's how that system works. Melatonin puts you to sleep. You don't go to sleep. That is not true for just about everybody that I interact with. They, unless they've been working with me for a little while, they're usually like, oh, it's 10 o'clock. I better go to sleep. Most people that have been working with me for a while, they realize, hey, I can't make it past 9 o'clock sometimes. I literally am falling, I'm dozing off, right? And that's when you know that you're doing things correctly, because melatonin is putting you to sleep. It's the hormone that kicks off the nighttime circadian switch, right? Of, oh, my body is now optimized for all these nighttime things that are supposed to happen. It's ready for sleep. Leptin gets released to a high degree. You get put to sleep. Once you're asleep, about 90 minutes later, thyroid will be manufactured, specifically T4. Once there's a high degree of T4 manufacturing, about 90 minutes after that, then growth hormone gets released. And then about 90 minutes after the growth hormone, then that's when leptin should be led into the hypothalamus. And then the system essentially starts all over. By that time, it's about 2 a.m. And then T4 will be converted into T3, getting ready for the morning to come. And then the next hormone that kicks off the daytime circadian metabolism is cortisol. Cortisol should be spiked nice and high and should remain high for about 4 to 5 hours the first half of the day. That's what's telling the body, hey, it's daytime. Let's turn on all the daytime manufacturing hormones like sex hormones and things of that nature.
And cortisol is inverse to melatonin. So if we're up late and we're being exposed to blue light, then we never really, we blunt that melatonin production.
And spike your cortisol.
Yes. And so that's where that like tired and wired happens. And then waking up and you don't feel very energized, like you slept, but even if you get that 8 hours of sleep, it's like from 2 a.m. to 9, like that's going to be very different than going to bed at 10 and getting up 8 hours later. So I would say, I mean, we could talk about this all day and get really into it, and it can feel really overwhelming because we're talking about hormones and we're talking about hormonal pathways, and it can feel like a lot. And I want everyone to feel like this is very doable. Like, we all want to improve our insulin sensitivity. We all want to feel good. We all want to minimize body fat to just a healthy place, like to support us in life, but also feel good and have optimal energy during the day. And so what would you say, David, like the top five, 3 to 5 things that people can do through these winter months to, we've talked about some of them, but just kind of like giving a punch list to really optimize insulin sensitivity?
Yeah. So focusing specifically on insulin sensitivity, I would say two things. Number one, take breaks throughout the day to go outside and leave the indoor environment. When you go outside, make sure that as much skin as possible is sensing the outside environment. It doesn't have to be for very long, 10 minutes at a time, right? I'm not telling you to go outside for an hour or whatever. 10 minutes is really all it takes.
That will
Yeah.
improve insulin as well.
Yeah, go for a 10-minute walk, slightly underdressed. Make sure that your as much skin as possible can be exposed to it. And in that context, I would say the most important time to do this is in the first half of the day, ideally the first 3 hours of the day, right? Somewhere around waking and the first 3 hours of being awake is when you should do your first stint of 10 or 15 minutes of going outside. And then, if possible, throughout the day, every couple hours, every 2 to 3 hours, right? Then the second most important thing is light at night, especially in the winter, because the sun will go down at 5 p.m. and everybody turns on all their lights. Now, I have a few hacks for that, but they're getting harder and harder to implement because it's harder and harder to get incandescent light bulbs or things that are not LED, right? Because LEDs, the reason why they're energy efficient is because they cut out every wavelength except for blue. They cut out the red, they cut out the green, they cut out the yellow. They don't have any infrared. And so a simple hack is upgrade your lighting, especially any lighting like at your office or anything like that, is going to be extremely beneficial to cut it out in terms of getting yourself in some incandescent light bulbs. My favorite are infrared incandescent light bulbs. You can hook them up to any kind of lamp or anything like that, or you just switch out the light bulbs in some lamps in terms of at your workstation or whatever. I'm just thinking of people that would be indoors and don't have an opportunity to take a break. The reason for that is because a lot of people don't know this. Incandescent light bulbs give off UVA and infrared light. They are essentially what we have substituted as sunlight for a long time, up until 2005, whenever the law came in place by Obama, where they were going to phase out incandescent light bulbs. And now pretty much everything is LED. So going out of your way to buy different types of light bulbs is a very simple hack, especially for the winter time in the evening.
So that's for people that are not able to get outside as much.
Yep, not able to get outside as much, or just know that they're not going to be able to control their light environment. So, for example, I don't use incandescent light bulbs because all my light bulbs are red, right? So at night, when we eat dinner, it looks like we're eating it under firelight because all my light is red in the whole house, right? And so you don't have to go to that extreme if you want regular type lighting, but I would at least change most of your light bulbs at night to the incandescent variety for those purposes.
Would you say, what about if you were just putting on your blue light blocking glasses and like dimming all of your lights in your house?
That would work too. But that's only going to work for you. In other words, it's not going to work for the rest of your family. That isn't, you see what I'm saying?
Right.
Most people that are going to be on this call are going to be moms, right? They have kids. This is a parent hack. I'll tell you that right now. You turn on some red lights or some incandescent light bulbs, your children will be asleep before you. Promise you. They will be falling asleep about 90 because see, they're more sensitive to it than you are. My kids never make it past 8:30 ever at any point in time during the year. Even in the summer when the sun's still out, because everybody's indoors at that point in time, I just turn on all the red lights. 90 minutes later, they are literally falling asleep.
Yeah, because that like starts that melatonin production.
Yeah, they're going to be way, way more sensitive to it. And in fact, most of my clients, this is like the number one thing. It's not even because it's helping them. It's because they're like, I don't have to fight my children to get them to bed every evening. They literally are falling asleep and I just pick them up and put them in their bed. That alone starts to tell you there's something wrong with the lighting that most people are using at night.
Yeah, and incandescent light bulbs, you can just get those on Amazon or
Unless you live in California.
okay.
Yeah, I'm not joking. In California, you can't buy any of that stuff.
Interesting.
You have to get it shipped to you from a friend or something like that. But yes, for most people, you're going to be able to get it just off of Amazon.
Okay, so that's essentially controlling like light and cold, how to use those to help improve insulin sensitivity. What about food and exercise? Anything you would
Yeah.
add to help improve insulin sensitivity with those?
Yeah. So food wise, in the winter, you essentially shift to whatever's available at your farmer's market. So in other words, you start eating less carbohydrates. And the way that I like to view it is if you're looking at a vegetation, anything that grows up high requires a lot of sunlight. Fruit is going to be the thing that requires the most amount of sunlight. Those are the things you want to avoid going into the fall and winter months. Fruit is the first thing that you want to start to cut out. The secondary thing is going to be things like grains, rice, breads, things of that nature. And you want to predominantly stick to tubers and things that grow at the ground level. Squashes, potatoes, things of that nature. Those are still carbohydrates that you're going to be able to consume pretty readily, but they have a much more time release type of way that they get digested. So insulin gets impacted less. So they're much easier at that time of the year to include in the diet. Like I said, I don't tell people to go carnivore or keto or anything like that. Some people that are on full on, pre-diabetic and stuff like that may need to go to that extent. But if you don't have any of that and you just have some level of insulin resistance, just shifting the types of carbohydrates that you consume in the fall and winter months goes a long way. Then in terms of exercise, things that are going to dramatically accelerate insulin sensitivity is aerobic work done in a cold environment. This is where things like cross-country skiing comes into mind. Or my favorite, which is what I do, I just have an elliptical that is outside. So I just go outside in my elliptical and the air that you're breathing is going to be at the air temperature. That's also going to induce a level of cold exposure at the mitochondrial level in the organs that are delivering energy to the body, the oxygen and all of that. So essentially, you're going to upregulate the level of glucose you can use per unit of time that you're working out. So
yeah, even walking, like getting outside.
You're going to want to get your heart rate up into like the zone 2 minimum would be, like actual walking at a leisurely place, probably not going to do much other than the other benefits of just being outside. But if you're doing exercise with the intent of lowering or reversing insulin resistance, you need to get at least into the zone 2 realm. And if you do it in a cold environment, then it's going to have a double impact there.
Yeah. Anyone have any questions on that? So we kind of obviously have talked about a lot. But just to review, getting in zone 2, if you can get it in outside and in a cold environment, that's going to be really optimal. Shifting to more seasonal eating, and this isn't like all or nothing. This would be just in general is going to help improve. Focusing on sleep hygiene, time of sleep, is going to be really helpful, but a lot of that's going to go into your light environment. So maybe getting blue light blocking glasses on Amazon, swapping a few lamps out so that your family can also benefit too, and optimizing that melatonin production, which is going to go beyond just insulin sensitivity, right? That's going to help us in so many ways, from hunger to morning and just energy throughout the day with cortisol optimization. And then also getting some cold exposure as the seasons change, getting outside more often, like continuing to get outside. I think we all emphasize getting outside in the warm months, and it's easy to do that. But knowing that our bodies, like we still need, we live in a very modern world, and that can impact us negatively. So remembering that getting outside can help optimize insulin sensitivity. But beyond that, mental health as well. I know that it's so hard for me to get outside in the wintertime, but when I do, I feel so much happier, and the winters are so much easier for me. And then someone else mentioned in the chat, use of deliberate red light therapy. Is that more beneficial or in line with UV light during day and changing light at night? Is it to use red light therapy? I think they're asking.
Well, red light therapy at any point in time is going to be beneficial. Now, when I say red light therapy, that means you're targeting something, right? You're shining the red light, on an injury or something you're trying to augment, or if you have a big enough red light panel, you're going to try to augment total body ATP production. That's what I call red light therapy. For example, you have your red light on right now. I wouldn't call that red light therapy. I would just call that you are adding infrared into the environment for your body to do whatever it needs to do. See, red light panel, sauna, tent, any of that type of stuff, that's targeted therapy. It's going to help you acutely, but it doesn't manifest its effects for the full day. Meaning, if I go into a red light sauna, for example, I'm going to get the benefits for maybe 60 minutes, right? The 20 minutes that I'm in the sauna and maybe 40 minutes after. That can be undone by going into the office for the next 12 hours, right? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is supplementing your indoor environment with red light, like what you're doing right now, right? You're in your office, you're indoors, you're going to be there for several hours, either doing programming or talking with your coaches. You're supplementing red light for your body to use that beneficially. That's not red light therapy, in my opinion. That is supplementing light that you're missing. That's what you're doing. And yes, I would do red light would definitely be the most dominant one that you're going to be missing the most. And UV light, for example, let's put it this way. At the beginning of this call, I said how most people are living in a stuck fall period, living indoors with that. What if I told you that if you wanted to, you could hack your indoor environment to permanently live in a summertime mechanism? That's what I'm experimenting with myself and other clients right now. I can tell you that it's looking pretty promising that yes, you can do that. You can live in a permanent summertime mechanism and eat summertime foods year round and not gain any body fat, but you have to go out of your way to get special lighting for the whole house, or essentially the whole room that you spend most of your time in. So that can be done, but it's done with light. It's not done with exercise. It's not done with drugs. It's done with light. So the light bulbs that I am using for this is halogen light bulbs. So halogen light bulbs put off UVC, UVB, and UVA, and a large amount of infrared. So I'm substituting people's workstations and all of the light bulbs inside that workstation, and in this case, in my house, with halogen light bulbs. You essentially have them on just like you would normally. So essentially all day long, those lights are shining on you as if it was sunlight, and you're going to essentially operate in summertime mode. You're going to wake up like it's summertime. So you're going to wake up super early, like 5 a.m. without an alarm clock, and you're going to go to bed kind of late, like it's summertime, about 9 p.m. before you start to get tired because you're using those types of lights. And you will notice that the way that you use carbohydrates or hunger cravings are like in summertime. I'm sure that you've noticed in the summertime you get less hungry, less snacky, that sort of stuff. You feel more energized, and your energy output goes up and energy intake in terms of food goes down. As far as those lights themselves, they're not proprietary. In fact, they're very common. You just Google halogen work lights. So again, this is
They're like $20.
they're not very expensive at all, but they are hard to come by because they're being phased out, right? So those are the types of lights that I'm inducing or using for inducing a permanent summertime effect that goes on. Now, as far as long-term consequences of that, if the lights are powerful enough, it probably won't be much of a consequence. So the setups that we're using are 2000 watts, right? So we're using 4 lights for that induction, and then they're essentially just shining on the person the whole time that they're indoors.
Each light is 500 watts. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I just posted one that's from Amazon, And then if I remember, David, when we've talked about this before, you need to take off that glass,
Correct. Yes.
because the glass is going to. And then what are like the dangers? Obviously, there's going to be like a fire risk, right?
Well, no, there is. That's what I'm saying. So
What
it's
are
going to get off. It's going to give off a lot of infrared heat. So
Yeah.
you have to have a setup where they're not going to be tipped over. People aren't going to touch them. That sort of stuff. There are some, but again, because you're literally making a mini sun, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. Most people are missing the sun. How do you bring that indoors? Well, it's not going to be with LED lights. It's not going to be with an infrared light is only going to give you the infrared light spectrum. How do you bring in UVC, UVB, everything else that the sun is also giving you in the summertime? Remember, I'm trying to replicate a summertime biological mechanism going on. So yes, these lights, you need to set them up in a place where they're not going to be touched and where they're not going to fall, on the ground or whatever, or get tipped over. They will be hot to the touch, just like when
Probably
we
not ideal in like throughout the house, but maybe if
correct, right. Yeah, these are special setups for people that are working, like for example, some of the people that I'm doing this with are traders and executives that, basically work from a workstation that's got like, 3 or 4 monitors on it, and they're sitting there all day doing trading and stuff like that, and they, are feeling like crap, and they're like, I can't really step away from the computer, every 2 hours or whatever. So I'm like, okay, well, let's bring the sun inside. Let's do it this way, right? And
Yeah.
most of them have realized big benefits. Basically, the way to describe it is exactly like I described, which is I feel like I'm in summertime. I feel like I'm running in summertime.
Yeah, just more energy and probably able to absorb nutrients better too from
Yeah,
carbohydrates.
and again, this is not really far-fetched to say it this way, which is the way that I say it to them is in this universe, energy cannot be created or destroyed. That's rule number one of physics. You cannot create energy out of nothing, and you cannot make or destroy energy. It's only transformed. So if your lights are absent energy, aka they are energy efficient, then and you are a mammal that normally operates in a sunlight environment that's giving you free energy, the lights that you are interacting with, if they are absent energy, then you are going to feel like you are absent energy. And that's exactly what all of these people report. The moment we add in lights that are giving off a lot of infrared light, a lot of UV light, aka they are using more energy and giving it off into that environment, they are picking it up and they literally feel more energized.
So I would say for the rest of us that just want to optimize and improve, take advantage of your nature, right? Get outside, get cold.
Again, this is for the most part, everybody can accomplish some significant changes completely free by just stepping outside regularly, right? If anything that anybody gets out of this, it's that it can
Yes.
be done for free, and the consequence of it is you step outside regularly. That's
Mhm.
about as complicated as it needs to be. And then at nighttime, you just be mindful of how much blue light you're getting. You, at a minimum, dim down your lights, use some lamps with some incandescent or red light bulbs in it. And that's about as difficult as it needs to get to see improvements for the average person.
Yeah. And pay a little bit more attention to food intake, shift to eating seasonally. All of these things you're going to see and feel improvements by doing something over nothing. So just knowing like what feels like the lowest hanging fruit for you this week, focus on that and then start to build on it. And maybe if you haven't had blood work done, I would recommend doing that annually. And ideally, like I like to get my blood work done September and April, May, so I can kind of see where I'm at coming into winter, where I'm at coming into summer, and just start to shift some little habits that are going to have a big impact on how you feel in this next season where it can be really hard to feel great in the winter months, especially if you're living in the higher latitudes. So
yeah. And on that note, for specifically for wintertime, I would at a minimum go out of my way to get some level of infrared light therapy, whether that's you either by a device or you go to an infrared therapy, because they have infrared saunas now that you can just go and rent like a tanning bed type of thing and things of that nature. All of those will be helpful periodically throughout the months and the weeks of the wintertime if you don't have one yourself. But
Yeah.
you can do that with cold exposure. I want to remind people that your body is capable of inducing red light type effects with enough cold exposure. It's just uncomfortable. So the only other option is to actually go seeking that type of light out.
Red light is nice and cozy. It's not uncomfortable at all, but it can be a cost, issue. So I think getting cold exposure and then seeking that out maybe in your community if you don't have your own device too. And someone asked, last question, is red light also best early in the day, like the walks?
It would be all day. If the sun is up, red light therapy is beneficial, right? And then the only time that I would say red light therapy is acceptable is in the evening, but not ideally not right before bed. And in other words, you're not getting a lot of infrared light on your eyes and face because the brightness of them, they are pretty bright, will circumvent some melatonin production. So I would say, off in the background as a lamp or as ambient lighting, totally fine, but not targeted infrared light therapy at night is not something that I would do. But during the day, yeah, you could do as much infrared light as possible. And early in the day, late in the afternoon, it doesn't really matter. The sun has infrared light all year round. That's what I'm saying. The hack is really to just go outside. That's for free.
Yes. Great. Thank you. If anyone has questions on insulin sensitivity or just like follow-up questions, be sure to ask in the app. And we thank you, David, for joining us today, and hope everyone has a great beginning of November on Friday.
That's right. All
And
right.
speaking of which, the time is changing for a lot of us if you're in the US. So that's happening next week too. So a good opportunity to get outside more as well and just push through what might be a little bit of an uncomfortable week. Any tips on time change?
Yeah, I don't know why they still do it.
I know we were just talking about that. So yeah. Hopefully someday that will go away. All right.
Yes, I think so.
Thanks everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.